Aphorism 20. That individual philosophical concepts are not something arbitrary, something growing up autonomously, but on the contrary, grew up connected and related to one another, that, however suddenly and arbitrarily they appear to emerge in the history of thought, they nonetheless belong just as much to a system as they do the members of the fauna of a continent. That fact is in the end also shown in the fact that the most diverse philosophers unfailingly fill out again and again a certain basic scheme of possible philosophies. Under an invisible spell, they always trace once more the identical orbit, however independent of one another they may feel, with their will to criticism or systemizing. Something in them leads them, something drives them in a defiant order one after another. It is precisely that innate systemism and relationship of concepts. Their thinking is in the fact not so much a discovering as a recognizing, a remembering, a return, and homecoming to a far-off, primordial, total household of the soul out of which those concepts once emerged. Philosophizing is to that extent a species of atavism of the first rank. The singular family resemblance between all Indian, Greek, and German philosophizing is also enough to explain. Where there exists a language affinity, it is quite impossible, thanks to the common philosophy of grammar. I mean, thanks to unconscious dominion and direction by similar grammatical functions, to avoid everything being prepared in advance for a similar evolution and succession of philosophical systems, just as the road seems to be barred to certain other possibilities of world interpretation. Philosophers within the domain of the Ural-Alatic languages, in which the concept of subject is least developed, will in all probability look into the world differently and being found on a different paths from the Indo-Germans and Muslims. The spell of defiant grammatical functions is in the last resort the spell of physiological value judgments and racial conditions. So much by way of retort to Locke's superficiality with regard to the origin of ideas. Aphorism 21. The causes C is the best self-contradiction hitherto imagined, a kind of logical reaping and unnaturalness, but mankind's extravagant pride has managed to get itself deeply and frightfully entangled with precisely this piece of nonsense. For the desire for freedom of will, in that metaphysical superlative sense which is unfortunately still dominant in the minds of the half-educated, the desire to bear the whole and sole responsibility for one's actions, and to absolve God, world, ancestors, chance, society from responsibility for them, is none the less than the desire to be precisely that causa sci. And, with more than Manchusian timidity, there to pull oneself into existence out of the swamp of nothingness by one's own hair. Assuming it is possible in this way to get beyond the peasant simplicity of this celebrated concept, free will, and banish it from one's mind, I would then ask whoever does that to carry his enlightenment a step further and also banish from his mind the contrary of that unnatural concept, free will, which is unfree will, which mounts to abuse of cause and effect. One ought not to make cause and effect into material things, as natural scientists do, and those who, like them, naturalize in their thinking. In accordance with the prevailing mechanism of stupidity, which has the cause press and push until it produces an effect, one ought to employ cause and effect only as pure concepts, that is to say, as conventional fictions for the purpose of designation, mutual understanding, not explanation. In the very fact, there is nothing of causal connection, of necessity, of in itself, of physiological unfreedom. There, the effect does not follow the cause. There are no laws or rules tied to it. It is we alone who have fabricated cause, succession, reciprocity, relativity, compulsion, number, law, freedom, motive, purpose, and when we falsely introduce this world of symbols into things and mingle it with them as though this symbol world were in itself, we once were believe and to behave as always as we have behaved, namely mythologically. Unfree will is mythology. In real life, it is only a question of strong and weak wills. It is almost always a symptom of what is lacking in itself when a thinker detects in every singular causal connection and philosophical necessity something for compulsion, agency, constraint, pressure, and unfreedom. Such feelings are traitors. The person who has them gives himself away. And if I have observed correctly, unfree will is generally conceived as a problem from two completely antithetical standpoints, but always in a profoundly personal manner. One will at no price give up his responsibility, his belief in himself, the personal right to his deserts. The vain races belong here. The other, on the contrary, will not be responsible for anything, to blame for anything, and out of an inner self-contempt wants to be able to shift off his responsibility for something elsewhere. This latter, when he writes books, tends today to espouse the cause of the criminal. His most pleasing disguise is a kind of socialist empathy. And the fatalism of the weak-willed is indeed beautified to an astonishing degree when it can present itself as la raison de la force humaine. That is its good taste. Welcome, everyone. I'm solo today. Once again. Two complex and lengthy aphorisms. First that strikes me of this aphorism 20 is linking with a aphorism in the joyful science. People say the gay science. It was a term used at the time and still today as a form of joy, but altered in the name of politics to a deprived form of the definition and its etymology. But in joyful science, he discusses consciousness and language. While consciousness is the least developed organ in our body, if we were dependent on every thought, idea, and concept of the consciousness, we wouldn't survive every flaw and error it committed. Thus, the instincts spare us from this error and flaw. Including the concepts that he'd say the individual philosophical concepts are nothing to be arbitrary, as something to be grown up as autonomous too. But he says it's the opposite. They grew up connected, and they were related to one another. Then suddenly and arbitrarily, they appear to emerge from the history of thought. As I said, if you tie his aphorism in The Joyful Science to this one, it becomes concise and understanding of why he's including in the first part of Beyond Good and Evil a section for ancient languages. Remember, Nietzsche himself was a philologist. He studied ancient languages. He realizes the multiple upon multiple tree branches and family of the languages intertwining with one another. Hence, that they nonetheless belong just as much to a system as do the members of the Fuena of a continent. What's a or not Fuena, but I'm mispronouncing the Funa. The Funa is a animal life that's present in a specific region or time in history. Say certain plants and fungi are flora and funga, respectively. If you search etymologically of what Fuana is, it's the Roman goddess of earth and fertility, the Roman goddess of Fuanas. You can relate to that of the continent, but it's at the same time that the Fuana, it's a specific species that existed once in a specific region and time, and it's subspecies of Cryofauna. It's the animals that, as the name implies, inhabit cold regions, and it existed to protect or conceal its micro inhabitants at the time that assisted it to flourish, which is the Epifauna, which are the aquatic version of this land species. Now, why are we tying Greek mythology with with specific animals and language? He's comparing fauna and language to a system of historical thought to specific continents. And you'll see later that he includes the Indians, Germans, and Greeks with their subspecies, with their previous phonical languages of the oral and Alatic languages. And he would say here, in which the concept of the subject is least developed, they were incognizant or not aware of the idea of subject from the collectivization of a civilization to them, and that became an affinity. Now, people use the word affinity loosely. It's not, when I say loosely or vaguely, this is the true definition of affinity: a spontaneous and natural. I'm remembering this definition from heart because I studied the dictionary at one time. Yes, I'm that style of person. I'm a nerd. Wow. It's a spontaneous or natural pleasing and sympathy for someone or something. But there's multiple definitions to this. I think this is the noun definition of it. There's other ones. It's a similarity of characters in a relationship that resemble structure between languages, plants, and animals. That's one. And then relationship of marriage of the opposite blood. There's another one, like something with a degree of substance, etc., etc. So affinity, to tie it with another word, kinship, or kinship, not king, kinship. The anthropology of cultures and law inside a created relationship or kinship, where somebody that existed from another non-blood related family married a person from another non-blood related family. And he's tying this with philosophers who again and again create a diverse scheme of possible philosophies. And this is sarcasm. The possibility of these philosophies. But while creating this scheme of possible philosophies, he says it's under an invisible spell they always trace once again to the identical orbit. However independent they are, as they may feel, they always have this will to criticism and systemizing. This criticism and systemism or systematizers, as he would say in Twilight the Idols, that he despises people who create systems as an objective truth to bear and repress people. So while people would think philosophically that these arbitrary and uncertain languages grew up autonomously, they didn't. They were linked, connected, related to one another in another form. As the same with the species of animals and continents. He was linking, again, the species of these animals to continents to how people migrated to one nation to another, developing language in the Ural-Alactic regions, similar to the Indo-Germans, or the Proto-Indo Europeans who migrated from the Far East to the Middle, to Africa, to modern-day Europe, and migrated to the Western Hemisphere of North and South America. But while criticizing these philosophers again, they, as he would say, something drives them to a definite order again and again. This is precisely that innate systematism and relationship of concepts. He's relating concept to concept from the first source. He would contradict himself from this aphorism to the next one, but it's not a contradiction in this aphorism, in this context. He's relating etymologically, remember he's a philologist, etymologically what these concepts and relation of concepts have depending on the language that evolved from. One example is the word ego. People associate that with the self or I inside a person. Nietzsche would say that's not what an ego is. It was a fictional concept that was created. But etymologically, the word ego is the Greek translation for I. There's your etymology for today. But he continues saying their thinking is in this fact not so much a discovering as a recognizing, a remembering, a return and homecoming to a far-off primordial total household of the soul out of which these concepts once emerged, but this is the species of atavism of the first rank. Atavism has a affinity, we'll use the word here, affinity to its reputation, where people I'm using the word vaguely, specialize and relate to their ancestral blood years before them. And it's this time that Nietzsche correlates that with philosophy of its atavism, or its ancestral primordial origins before modern romanticism of his time, or his modernity. And to continue forward, that with these systems and relations of concepts and tracking their origins, he's saying that they have, in this first rank of atavism, that every singular family resembles one another, of the Indians, Greek, and German philosophy, as he would say, is easy enough to explain. First time people hearing and writing and reading Nietzsche, it's not easy enough to explain. For him, yes, as a philologist, but to people who aren't philologists or unfamiliar with the Indian, Greek, and German philosophy, or philosophy itself, it's complex. Here's, not in layman terms, but a concise description of the resemblance of Indian, Greek, and German philosophy. India itself is complex with its spirituality. Hinduism itself is not the religion of It's not the word they use for the religion in India. Same with Buddha. Not the same with Buddhism, but they don't use they don't want use the word Buddhist. They use the word enlightened. Hence the nickname Buddha. It the nickname Buddha is translated to enlightened one or enlightened thinker, wanderer, depending on the translation. So it's the realm of spirituality, and that migrated the Proto-Indo species, or the early Aryans, in this sense, not the Third Reich sense, migrated to Greece, and the regions of Germania. And while migrating to these two prominent regions, and with the evolution of language, and he would say in the Aphorism of the Joyful Science that it was this desperation of communication that the consciousness became herd-like, and that communication and words are ubiquitous or everywhere to a static and fixed form, where words are fixed and thoughts are lucid and evolving from one form to another, or overcoming one another in a dynamic of power relations. And with the history of Greek philosophy, everybody's heard of the Greek philosophers from pre-Socratic, Socratic era, and post-Socratics. Now, the Germans were, say, with Leipzig, he was one of the Germans, not Spinoza. He was Dutch, but inside the realm of Germanic philosophy, they include Spinoza and Leipzig, including Hegel, Fawcett, Schelling, Kant, etc., etc. But because it's a singular family that's resembling one another, they're reiterating or saying again to one another what the Proto-Indians had taught them, and what to the Greeks, to the Germans, and vice versa, through a commonality of systemizing and relational concepts. If you can grasp and understand what I'm saying, is that they're related to one another in physiological and psychological concepts, but they used a philosophical mode of talking and thinking to the point where it's not digestible for everybody. That's where, as he would say, where these exists a language affinity. If it is quite impossible, thanks to the common philosophy of grammar. I mean, thanks to unconscious domination or domination and directing by similar grammatical functions. He's loving that these unconscious dominations occur with these direct similar grammatical functions, hearkening to what he said in The Joyful Science as, if these instincts didn't live, we would have died long ago. Because we didn't develop language as quickly as people interpret or infer to think that we did. Language was a slow process. It began, say, 2500 BC, and it continued developing forward. Hence the desire for this language as it continued forward, and the grammar included in it. Now consciousness is seen as the kernel of intelligence and enlightenment. Nietzsche would say, that's the contrary to that. Why is it the contrary to that? Because it's this. It avoids everything being prepared in advance for a similar evolution and succession of philosophical systems. just as the road seems to be barred with other possibilities of world interpretations. That's including his perspectivalism, or the perspective theory. But the theory is refuted and reinverted as a reality once people began seeing what Nietzsche was saying. Or people would say a a degree of foresight. And he continues forward with these philosophers, specifically in the domain of the oral alatic languages. What's the oral alatic languages? This family tree is simple but complex depending on the source. It's simple because it's a form of separate Turkish languages that were once the Oralic and Atalic groups that constitute two unaffiliated and separate language families. But however, were the authorities of this single form of a family linguistics. These Turkish languages are, the Turkish language itself, plus the Uzbek, Kyrgyz, or not Kyrgyz, Kyrgyz, Azeri, Azerbaijani, and other Ural Alatic languages. Includes every language from the time of the indigenous people of the Ural Mountains in Russia that migrated south to southeast, southwest, etc., and inside the United States, where it developed to Native American languages. While he's saying this, that the Oral Alatic languages will in all probability look, air quoting, into the world differently and be found on different paths from the Indo-Germans and Muslims. In this translation, they have the 19th century spelling of Muslim, the Moslems, just drastically different from how we spell Muslim today. We pronounce it the same, but in different spelling. And he says the spell of defined grammatical functions is at least resorted to spell of physiological value judgments and racial conditions. So much, by the way, retorted to Locke's superficiality with regard to the origin of ideas. Criticism of Locke's idea that our mind is a blank sheet of rock once we're born, and we develop it by crafting on the sheet of the slate, not sheet, but the slate of rock. And he's saying that this is superfluous. Why talk about this? Or superfluous and superficial, aka surface and pointless. Surface value and pointless. But with this defined grammatical functions came the physiological judgments and what he saw at his time, anti-Semitism of racial conditions, which continues forward. People would say, well, he's going all over the place with this aphorism. He's not. He's tying the two of philosophical concepts with the ancient languages and saying this is not arbitrary or autonomous, but they were related to one another. But while they were related to one another, there became the will to criticism and systematizing everything from the first rank of philosophy in the species of atavism. And now that the relation of these concepts continue, it becomes a format for Nietzsche to criticize, and for people before Nietzsche to realize what it was at the time. One example, Montaigne, another one, Spinoza, and another one, Machiavelli. every single one of them realized that that reason isn't the true source, and that this will, or a form of power of the will, is the true source for strength, fortuna or fortune. Translate that to fate, virtue or valor and discipline and courage, etc., etc. And the man with this virtue can determine the fortuna of his life. Thus, these judgments from physiological values, which reflect a psychological prejudice of people. That ties everything with Aphorism 20. Aphorism 21, he accelerates everything, what he said in the previous aphorisms, to this, where the Latin word again, causae, self, cause, is the best contradiction, as he would say, imagined before time. A kind of logical reasoning and unnaturalness, where it reaps and absorbs, and to a degree, it involves a form of distortion to what the language of this word is, to the correlation of the person, to the person and their prejudice. As he would say, this became man's extravagant pride, and include prejudice inside this, to get itself deeply and frighteningly entangled with this piece of nonsense. And he discusses again the freedom of will is a metaphysical, or in that metaphysical superlative sense, with its unfortunately still dominant in the minds of the half-educated, to desire to bear the whole and sole responsibility for one's actions while absolving or denouncing and ridding of God, world, ancestors, chance, and society from responsibility for them. And nonetheless, this becomes a desire of self-cause, with a source, which was more enough a Munchian timidity to pull oneself into existence out of the swamp of nothingness by one's hair, aka once you dissolve all these concepts, you pull yourself from nothingness, or this pathological swamp of nothingness, to existence again. Now this becomes complex. He first says extravagant pride of man, or that became a piece of nonsense or stupidity. He would say, as he would say so. Why is an extravagant pride of man? To think of being free. If you're free, commit freely what you desire. Act upon your desire. But why is punishment, guilt, and judgment tied to something that I'm freely acting on? As Nietzsche would say in Twilight of the Idols, with his the four great errors, in the section of free will, he'd say this: men were considered free only so that they may be considered guilty, could be judged and punished. Consequently, every act had to be considered as willed, and the origin of every act had to be considered as lying within the consciousness. And thus, the most fundamental concept of psychology became a deception, as would be the principle of psychology itself. You plausibly heard of Sam Harris with his free will short book of how he's denouncing free will and becoming a determinist atheist from denouncing this religious and Christian and Platonic idea. Nietzsche is the opposite. He denounces he denounces indeterminism, free will, and determinism, unfree will. He includes this free will and unfree will, or unfree will determinism, as cause and effect into material things, as natural scientists do. And observe today how scientists love to work with metaphysical concepts and theories as for seeking truth, while they say in public, "Oh, I have no concern with this. Oh, why are you seeking this?" And once they say or well, you see, you've cornered them. So this became a pride of man of possessing this free will, but never questioning why they're condemned to guilt, punishment, and judgments for committing their crimes in the eyes of criminals, aka these people who have tyrannized, repressed, and deceived maliciously of these freely acting people who are deceived in the first place of possessing free will. He continues forward of this free will, and that became an unfortunate dominance in the brain or the mind of the half-educated, aka the stupid. And that one was the desire to bear the whole and sole responsibility, but while getting rid of God, world, ancestors, chance, and society from responsibility for them. They're saying, "Oh, while you got rid of all of," he's saying, while you're getting rid of all of this and saying that you're the cause of yourself, while at the same time you're not the cause of yourself. You didn't create yourself, nor these ancestors, nor this God, nor this society, nor your parents, nor chance itself. You developed solely from the fact of fate. Fate isn't chance. Fate is everything independent beyond control. Fate decided you. Not your society, not your ancestors. You're not your author, or nor you were created out of without, nor you created from the absence of will, because will, the power, is your representation. That's one form of the will. When it's not the one form, but it's another action of the will to power: reproduction, creativity, fluidity, etc., etc., etc. But if you absolve this, you pull your hair once again from the swamp of nothingness, this pathology of nothingness that's spewing and intoxicating everybody, but they're blinded from this intoxication. So he would say, if you are enlightened, you should also banish and take a step further of this contrarian, unnatural concept to unfree will. Because scientists love to naturalize their thinking. Nietzsche would say, it's time to dehumanize nature and naturalize man. Hence, scientists love humanizing nature and denaturalizing man. And outside the scientists, too, with people reiterating what other people had said with no critical thinking of their own, and that generates a form of laziness. I'm staring at you, middle class. But this prevailing or winning mechanistic stupidity became the press and push until it produces an effect. And he would say in the Genealogy of Morals, the first essay, Aphorism 13, of comparing lightning and flash, and the moralists loving to separate the two and say that the lightning is the cause while the true action is the flash itself. And it's a neutral substratum, and he said there was no substratum. There's no doer behind it because they're part of it. The deed is everything, as he would say in that aphorism. And now, this is the crucial part. One ought to employ cause and effect only as pure concepts, including determinism. Well, that's determinism itself, including free will. Great water. Every time. So, including that cause and effect duality, which he associates with every determinist and every scientist, including Spinoza. He criticized Spinoza with his teleological principle of power. But there's no teleos or telos or teleology of power. He continues forward that this pure designation and understanding, not explanation, is the fiction for, in itself, causal connection, necessity, and physiological unfreedom. There, the effect does not follow the cause, nor the law of rules. This alone has fabricated causes, succession, reciprocity, relativity, compulsion, number, law, freedom, motive, purpose. And when we falsely introduce this world of symbols into the mingled world itself, and this becomes a symbol world where, in itself, we are once more behaved as we have always behaved, namely, mythologically. That's a reality. While he's ranting philosophically, this is multiple times where Nietzsche is blunt and fact and non-fictional in front of you. He's why are you living in a realm of ideas, mythos, and legend, where you have this static thinking, where you just ponder all day, and you never act upon that pondering? It fuels you, but you only let it sit there and let it become dust. When that dust happens, it erodes and it becomes nothing. So now you would be thinking of the abyss, which is nothing. And that's the one time I don't pull his ideas from the ether or his brain in the sky and drag it to reality, the physical reality, and say, hey, this is what he said, this is what he's trying to say, or this and that. He said it right in front of you. And this ties with multiple aphorisms he said before, with the one of criticizing absolute knowledge, thing in itself, Descartes, that false judgments aren't necessarily objection to judgments itself. And here's the striking bluntness again of Nietzsche. Unfree will is mythology. In real life, it is only a question of strong and weak wills. This isn't a dichotomy. This is a biological issue that's continued for millennia. And this here is criticizing too of Herbert Spencer's Survival of the Fittest and Charles Darwin's natural selection, which he'd say that's a form of will to truth, but as a will to existence, where you've simplified and solved the riddle of life with one word or one statement or one theory. It's hypocritical of Nietzsche, he uses the same tactic with the will to power. That's a subject for another time, and I've said and described everything plausible of the will to power in other episodes. So watch those episodes before you watch this one. It is almost always a symptom of what is lacking in himself when a thinker in every direct or detects in every causal connection and physiological necessity something of compulsion, exigency, constraint, pressure, and unfreedom, which such feelings are traitors, and the person who has them gives himself away. AKA, why are you connecting these two? It's unnecessary to. It's not a psychological necessity to this, because the necessity in man is the power inside man for a finer intuition, and that realizing that arbitrary is an afterthought and created fixed word to describe something, because everything is arbitrary and spontaneous in life. But while it's spontaneous and arbitrary, aka randomness, they're related to one another. They complement one another. It's another shade of color complementing the other shade of color. Same with two colors creating another. If you mix blue and red, there's purple. There. Think of Star Wars with Mace Windu's lightsaber. It's purple. Yes, Samuel L. Jackson commanded a purple lightsaber. In reality, it's two opposing forces being used at once. That's Mace Windu. He can use his frustration while using his equanimity and limitation, or seizing himself from this pressure with the light side. I'm not saying become a light side, dark side user, or red, blue pill, black pill subscriber, as people love to plagiarize and fabricate what Nietzsche is saying in the red pill, blue pill realm. Sometimes black pill, if you arrive at the source that preaches Nietzsche as a deliverer of the black pill. It's not what Nietzsche is saying. Nietzsche is saying desire a freedom of will and have an affirmation of life. The freedom of will is tied with the necessity in man, while receiving a sense of power and freedom from overcoming resistance. That's your source of pleasure, true pleasure, while freeing your will from limitations, concepts, ideas, theories, idealism, and modern science. But they're tied together because, yes, you're not the true autonomous sovereign person, but at the same time, you're contributing to what the will to power is. Becoming. The eternal innocence of becoming. And it'd say in Twilight of the Idols itself that this is the grand emancipation, that no one be made responsible any longer, that the mode of being be not traced back to causa prima, aka the first cause, that the world be not regarded as a unity, either as a sensorism or as a spirit. It is thereby that the becoming of innocence is once again restored. The concept of God has hitherto been the greatest objection to existence. We deny God. We deny responsibility by denying God. It is thereby that we have saved the world. That's Nietzsche. And it continues forward as if I have observed correctly, while remembering that these that the person who is pressured, unfreed, compulsion, exigency is restrained with these concepts, he's throwing himself to death in Nietzsche's eyes. If I observe correctly, unfreedom of will is in general conceived as a problem from two completely antithetical standpoints. One has always, in a profoundly personal manner, one will at no price give up his responsibility, his belief in himself, the personal right to his deserts. The vain races belong here. The other, on the contrary, will not be responsible for anything, to blame for anything, and out of the inner self-contempt wants to be able to shift off his responsibility for himself onto others. That's familiar. Strikingly familiar. This latter, when he writes books, tends today to espouse the cause of the criminal. His most pleasing disguise is a kind of socialist empathy. That fatalism of the weak will is indeed beautified in astonishing degree when it can at present itself as la raison de la souffrance humaine. That is its good taste. What is this German, or not German, the French translation of this? I'm Googling it quickly. You became unprepared. Why have you done this? It's fascinating sometimes. But while I'm Googling this and having the translation, oh, it has everything in French. Never mind. Nonetheless, while I'm translating this, I'll say this is a distinct and a defiant criticism and critique of two people, the two antitheses of people who won't give up this responsibility, aka the free will person, his belief in sarcastically saying himself this personal right to his deserts, while the person who purportedly isn't responsible for everything is at the same time, with his inner contempt, criticizing other people. And he would correlate this as socialist empathy. With the inner contempt, or he would say in Genealogy of Morals, ressentiment or resentment, is criticizing the authorities for their responsibility. That's familiar to an unauthentic democracy in politics, because a king can be bought while democracy is sold every day. He writes books, and to espouse the cause of the criminal is this pleasing disguise of this empathy. He's never read Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, but that's familiar and tied with the people those two have influenced, their subservient children. So they shift off their responsibility for themselves somewhere else, aka saying, you did this, questioning and defying people. You did this. You are guilty of this. You are wrong, but I still believe in free will, so you can still do it. But if you still do it, you'll be guilty and wrong of it. And thus they imprison you. And this causes a fatalistic, weak will that is indeed beautified to a degree when it can present itself with the French translation of the religion of human suffering. That is its good taste. AKA, responsibility is the religion of human suffrage. That itself is everything I have to say. Maybe with the extravagant pride of free will, where a man is anticipating the weight of his of his God to arrive at the same time while arriving for this person's God. He's sacrificed, well, not sacrificed, because nothing is limited to a stimuli, nor the world is immutable, for this freedom is interpreted as a power. It's true, and nothing's limited to a stimuli. It's similar to how a pious man becomes godless and a godless man becomes pious. It's because the power of these values and virtues overcome him in seek of his will to truth. His personal will to truth, not an objective will to truth, but nonetheless seeking truth and not receiving power for themselves. Because of this extravagant pride of man, as he would say, is a stupidity. It relates to the vision of man who is waiting for this relapse of eternal waiting of the Creator, who the Creator sits, waits, and observes everything beyond time. But at the same time, this man is subdued, tranquilized, and numb from this waiting. That is everything. Appreciate of you liking, commenting, and subscribing. Anticipate a guest Saturday. Yes, another Saturday video. There's a link in the description to the Men's Academy. I'm inside it, including the guests that I've invited from previous episodes and the one that I'm inviting for Saturday. Amor fati. Love your fate.